This is Heather Greene, whiskey expert and author of Whiskey Distilled, a populous guide to the water of life. And this is season 2 of Whiskey School, and we are doing a deep dive into bourbon. Now, I chose to stand in front of an empty rick house practically because I want to demonstrate this is what's happening all over America. Bourbon is on fire. Bourbon, we can't keep enough on the shelves. I can't even keep enough of them in our warehouse. And it's really, really fascinating because Americans can't get enough of bourbon. And I want to start Whiskey School Season 2 with a deep dive. The next 5 episodes are all about bourbon. And I want to dispel some myths. I really want to get into what bourbon is, what it isn't, what some of the myths surrounding bourbon are, and really kind of cut to the chase when it comes to helping you guys, helping the consumer understand how to buy a bourbon, how to be a better consumer. So let's start with the basics. Now, even if you think you know everything there is to know about bourbon, this is a great refresher. So let's talk about what bourbon is before we start talking about what it isn't. So what is bourbon at its core? Well, bourbon is a beautiful American spirit that must be made in the United States. So in order to be called a bourbon on the label, it must be made in the United States. Number 2, bourbon must be made with at least 51% corn, and that 49%, I call it up for grabs. You can use more corn, you can use barley, you can use wheat, a lot of us use rye. So these are really ways that we can help create flavors choosing the particular types of grain, but in order to be called a bourbon, it must be at least 51% corn. The second or third thing that needs to happen is when we do our distillation for bourbon, we can't distill to more than 160 proof in that still. 161, can't call it a bourbon. 158, that's fine. You can call it a bourbon. Now, the higher the proof in that still, the higher we have for our percentage of alcohol, that's essentially what that is, we can start getting it really high. You know, that's what vodka makers do. It becomes cleaner. It becomes much more stripped, I guess you could say, of flavor. But we want to have those robust flavors, so we set the parameters. 160 proof is the max we can go inside our distillation apparatus, whether it's a column or a pot still, to be called a bourbon. Once it comes off the still, we can only fill it to a max of 125 proof in one of these containers. Okay, so we cannot fill these if the proof going into the barrel is more than 125 proof. So we get to play with the proof as long as it's up to 125, and then off of our still, we can't distill over 160. And these are a little bit complicated to understand, but the most important thing to remember is we are held to a standard of what we can and how we play with proofs. Next, if you noticed, I said container. By law, bourbon must be aged in new charred oak container. Okay. This behind me is a barrel. It's a unit of measure. A barrel is 63 gallons. You could also have something larger or something smaller as long as it is that new charred oak. And then finally, it must be bottled at 40% ABV or 80 proof. Remember, to get your proof, you just double ABV. And that is it. Those are the things we do to be called a bourbon. Next, we will get into what happens when people start busting boundaries and how they produce a bourbon. There's a lot of myths about that. I have a lot of things to say about the controversies or what people think are the controversies there, so stay tuned.